getting late, I should go to bed. I never fought an extension short dress. Well, I can't spend the day in my bed. There's no one at home, no text to be read. I hope the end of your set. All my friends stay, no one's upset. I hope we all dance and we all break a sweat. Find a working outlet. I've heard what you're thinking of. It tears me to pieces. Is it your mom you were thinking of? A whole army, small but not giving in. I'm feeling safer than I knew I could be. With your arms dragging me into that sea. I'm feeling safer than I knew I could be. With your arms dragging me into that sea. It's getting late, I should go to bed. It's getting late, I should go to bed. It's getting late, I should go to bed.
Hello, everyone. How's it going? I've been on this hell site for a year, yesterday. But if you follow me on Twitter, I'm sure you all saw the fiasco that was, oh no, I share a 1-year streaming anniversary with Ranboo. Oh, it's fine, I'll just do it the day before. Oh, never mind, he's streaming his the day before. Okay, so I'll do it the day of. No, he's streaming the day of too. Okay, well, I'll do it that morning. Oh, Phil's doing an Asian-friendly stream. I love Phil's in Minecraft, but he fucked me over. So I didn't stream yesterday. I watched Narnia yesterday, and then wrote a really long meta on Tumblr. And that is how I wound up deciding, you know what I'm gonna do for hey, I've been on streaming for 1 year. I'm just going to read Narnia. We're bringing back Storytime Sunday, at least for today. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing them because I really quit having fun with them. But we're going to read Narnia. You can't see me, but I'm holding up my giant book that is the entire Chronicles of Narnia in one volume. But Narnia, growing up, was one of my favorite series. It still kind of is. There's, a lot of things to be talked about in Narnia, I think. But a lot of people, it's funny because, I was conservative homeschooled, so a lot of the kids growing up, either they weren't allowed to read it because it was, there was a witch in it. heaven forbid we read something with a witch in it. They were the kids, like, their parents were like my parents, saying I couldn't read Harry Potter, but they took it to, like, the next level. They're like, no, you can't read the very clearly Christian book series because there's a witch in it. That, or then a lot of people I met didn't want to read Narnia because it was an allegory. But, like, outside of it being an allegory, it's a fucking great story. Or at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is. I'm not as fond of the other ones. Okay, The Silver Chair is good. But The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is one of my favorite books of all time. And I grew up on it. And I love it a lot. So we're just going to read Narnia for a while. I don't know how far we'll get. I don't know how long my voice will hold out. But we're just going to sit and read and chill. And it's not going to be as, like, intense as the normal Storytime Sundays. Like, Narnia is pretty light. I'll probably stop and just chat a little bit every now and then. Also, do you guys want the rain sounds on is the thing. I can turn rain sound on to go with this little video that I've got going because I don't want to give you guys a blank screen. So, like, if you want the rain noises, I can turn on that ambience, and you can, I don't know, use me to study to or something. If not, I will just leave them off. But yeah. You know, the Narnia movies also aren't that bad. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a spectacular movie, mostly because they followed the book. Prince Caspian kind of sucks. And we don't talk about Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Okay, I will turn on the sounds. How's that? Good? Good volume? Oh wait, that's gonna shrink that down. Okay. Alright. Okay. Then we will, yeah. Go take a nap. Take a nap to me. Let me read you to sleep. We're just gonna chill. Might chat for a little while afterwards. But consider this your bedtime story if you need it. Happy 1 year on Twitch to me. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Lucy looks into a wardrobe. Once there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once, but on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh, and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." This is the really tame version of him saying, "Go fuck yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I'll tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There will be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains nor the woods nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. A long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so." Oh wow, I just closed the fucking book. Oh my god. I'm having a morning. Morning! Wow. Hold on, here we go. Alright, here we go. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore in the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you could never seem to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would, but soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung up with green, with a harp in one corner, and then came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony. And then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, the most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that had a looking-glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats, and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is very foolish to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. "This must be a simply enormous wardrobe," thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "I wonder, is that more mothballs?" she thought, stooping down to feel at it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "This is very queer," she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Coughs. I have so many sexually romantically things. Queer indeed. Coughs. Next moment she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like the branches of trees," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood, at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to still be daylight there. "I can always get back if something goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it, and found it was a lamp-post. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamp-post in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees and into the light of the lamp-post.
He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first, because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler round his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave such a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Chapter 2. What Lucy Found There. "Good evening," said Lucy, but the fawn was so busy picking up its parcels that at first it did not reply. When it had finished, it made her a little bow. Good evening," said the fawn. "Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. "But you are, forgive me, you are what they call a girl?" said the fawn. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "You are, in fact, human?" "Of course I'm human," said Lucy, still a little puzzled. To be sure, said the fawn. "How stupid of me, but I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before. I am delighted. That is to say," and then it stopped as if it had been going to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "And may I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how you have come into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the fawn, "where we are now, all that lies between the lamp-post and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come from the wild woods of the west?" I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus, in a rather melancholy voice. "If only I had worked harder at my geography when I was a little fawn, I should no doubt know all about those strange countries. It is too late now.
Play a little GeoGuessr, it's like totally not too late."
"But they aren't countries at all," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there. At least, I'm not sure. It is summer there." "Meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long. And we shall both catch cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the far land of Spare Oon, where eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back." "It's only just round the corner," said the fawn, "and there will be a roaring fire, and toast, and sardines, and cake." "Well, it's very kind of you," said Lucy, "but I shan't be able to stay long." "If you will take my arm, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now, off we go." And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with this strange creature as if they had known each other all their lives. They had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough and there were rocks all about and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he was going to walk straight into an unusually large rock, but at the last moment Lucy found he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of a wood fire. Then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire, and with a neat little pair of tongs and little lamp. "Now we shan't be long," he said, and immediately put a kettle on. Lucy thought she had never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone with a carpet on the floor and 2 little chairs, one for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a grey beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom. and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks, and Gamekeepers, a Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? Now, Daughter of Eve, said the fawn. And really, it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg, lightly boiled, for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances, and how the nymphs who lived in the wells and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns, about long hunting parties after the milk-white stag who could give you wishes if you caught him, about feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs deep in deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor, and then about summer when the woods were green and old Silenus on his fat donkey would come to visit them, with sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end. Not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then to cheer himself up, he took from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, "Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you, and I do love that tune, but really, I must get home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes." "It's no good now, you know," said the fawn, laying down its flute and shaking its head at her very sorrowfully. "No good?" said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. "What do you mean? I've got to get home at once. The others will be wondering what has happened to me." But a moment later she asked, "Mr. Tumnus, whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and then the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of its nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus! Mr. Tumnus!" said Lucy in great distress. "Don't! What is the matter? Are you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what is wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if his heart would break, and even when Lucy went over and put her arms round him and lent him her handkerchief, he did not stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it, wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be any more use, so that presently Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop! Stop it at once! You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you! What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. "I think you are a very good fawn. You are the nicest fawn I've ever met." "Oh, you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. "No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" asked Lucy. "My old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture over the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this." "A thing like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service under the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch." "The White Witch? Who is she?" "Why, it is she who's got all Narnia under her thumb. It's she who makes it always winter, and never Christmas. Think of that." "How awful," said Lucy. "But what does she pay you for?" "That's the worst of it," said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. "I'm a kidnapper for her, that's what I am. Look at me, Daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the wood, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it asleep and then handing it over to the White Witch?" "No," said Lucy. "I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort." "But I have," said the fawn. "Well," said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. "Well, that was pretty bad, but you're so sorry for it that I'm sure you will never do it again." "Daughter of Eve, don't you understand?" said the fawn. "It isn't something I have done. I'm doing it right now, this very moment." "What do you mean?" cried Lucy, turning very white. "You are the child," said Tumnus. "I had orders from the White Witch that if ever I saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her." and you are the first I have ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her." "Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "You won't, will you? Indeed you really mustn't." "And if I don't," he said, beginning to cry again, "she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hooves and turn them into horrid solid hooves, like a wretched horse's. And if she is extra and especially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be only a statue of a fawn in her horrible house, until the 4 thrones at Cair Paravel are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen at all." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but please let me go home." "Of course I will," said the fawn. "Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course I can't give you up to the witch, not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll see you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your own way from there back to Spare Oom and Wardrobe?" "I'm sure I can," said Lucy. "We must go as quietly as we can," said Mr. Tumnus. "The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side." They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not at all like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could, without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. "Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve?" said Mr. Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees, and could just see in the distance a patch of light that looked like daylight. "Yes," she said, "I can see the wardrobe door." "Then be off home as quick as you can," said the fawn, "and can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do?" "Why, of course I can," said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand. "And I do hope you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account." "Farewell, daughter of Eve," said he. "Perhaps I may keep the handkerchief?" "Rather," said Lucy. Oh God, that was so British. And then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs could carry her. And presently, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt wooden boards. And all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the same empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear the voices of the others in the passage. "I'm here," she shouted. "I'm here. I've come back. I'm all right." That's the end of that chapter. We'll take a drink.
I also don't know if you can tell, but this book has, like, I don't remember about the rest of the books, but, like, this book particularly has had, like, such an obvious influence on my style, like, my writing style. It's like I don't have a lot of things in common with C.S. Lewis's style, but, like, he has a really conversational way of writing descriptions that I think I do. I definitely picked up a lot from him. Let's see. Chapter 3. Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other 3. "It's all right," she repeated. "I've come back." "What on earth are you talking about, Lucy?" asked Susan. "Why?" said Lucy in amazement. "Haven't you all been wondering where I was?" "So you've been hiding, have you?" said Peter. "Poor old Lou. Hiding and nobody noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you." "But I've been away for hours and hours," said Lucy. The others all stared at one another. "Batty," said Edmund, tipping his head. "Quite batty." "What do you mean, Lou?" asked Peter. "What I said," answered Lucy. "It was just after breakfast when I went into the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours, and had tea, and all sorts of things have happened." "Don't be silly, Lucy," said Susan. "We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there then." "She's not being silly at all," said Peter. "She's just making up a story for fun. Aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she?" "No, Peter, I'm not," she said. It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a fawn and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see." The others did not know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back with her into the room.
She rushed ahead of them, flung open the door of the wardrobe, and cried, "Now! Go in and see for yourselves." "Why, you goose," said Susan, putting her head inside and pulling the fur coats apart. "It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it." Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood and no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure that it was solid. "A jolly good hoax, Lou," he said as he came out again. "You've really taken us in, I must admit. We half believed you." "But it wasn't a hoax at all," said Lucy. "Really and truly. It was all different a moment ago. Honestly, it was. I promise." "Come, Lou," said Peter. "That's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Hadn't you better drop it now?" Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and burst into tears. For the next few days she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any of the new countries and other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, and lying in the heather. But Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it, and so things went on until the next wet day. That day, when it came to the afternoon and there was no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide-and-seek. Susan was it, and as soon as the others scattered to hide, Lucy went into the room where the wardrobe was. She did not mean to hide in the wardrobe, because she knew that would only set the others talking again about the whole wretched business. But she did want to have one more look inside of it, for by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the Fawn had not been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought she would have time to have a look into the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She did not shut it properly because she knew that it is very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it is not a magic one. Now the steps she had heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to get into it himself, not because he thought it was a particularly good place to hide, but because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. He opened the door. There were coats hanging up as usual, and a smell of mothballs, and darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. "She thinks I'm Susan, come to catch her," said Edmund to himself, "and so she's keeping very quiet in the back." He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing this is to do. Then he began feeling about for Lucy in the dark. Whoa, hold on, sorry, I shifted position. He had expected to find her in a few seconds, and was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he could not find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and began groping wildly in every direction. He even shouted out, "Lucy! Lou! Where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound. Not the sound you would expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went towards the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping out from a shadow of some thick, dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was a crisp, dry snow under his feet, and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. Overhead there was a pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him, he saw between the tree trunks the sun just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees, and the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he had been looking for Lucy,
and also how unpleasant he had been to her about her imaginary country, which now turned out to not have been imaginary at all. He thought that she must be somewhere quite close, and so he shouted, "Lucy! Lucy, I'm here too! Edmund!" There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund. And though he did not like to admit that he had been wrong, he also did not much like being alone in this strange, cold, quiet place, so he shouted again, "I say, Lou, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now you were right all along. Do come out. Make it Pax." I don't understand this 1940s slang. Still, there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, sulking somewhere and won't accept an apology. He looked around him again and decided he did not much like this place, and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard, very far off in the wood, a sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sledge drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were the size of Shetland ponies, and their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared to them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone like something on fire when the sunlight caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf, who would have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. But behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person, a great lady, taller than any woman Edmund had ever seen. She was also covered in white fur up to her throat, and held a long, straight golden wand in her right hand, and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight as it came swooping towards Edmund, with the bells jingling and the dwarf cracking his whip, and the snow flying up on each side of it. "Stop!" said the lady, and the dwarf pulled the reindeer up so sharply that they almost sat down. Then they recovered themselves and stood champing their bits and blowing. In the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils looked like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund, rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking sterner than ever. "I beg your pardon, your majesty. I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" cried she. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund. "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least, I was. It's the holidays now." Well, that was a really abrupt chapter. It's the weirdest chapter break I've ever seen. What? Chapter 4. Turkish Delight. "But what are you?" said the queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off its beard?" "No, your majesty," said Edmund. "I never had a beard. I'm a boy." "A boy," said she. "Do you mean you are a son of Adam?" Edmund stood still, saying nothing. He was too confused by this time to understand what the question meant. "I see you are an idiot, whatever else you may be," said the queen. "Understood. Answer me once and for all, or I shall lose my patience. Are you human?" "Yes, your majesty," said Edmund. "And how, pray, did you come to enter my dominions?" "Please, your majesty, I came in through a wardrobe." "A wardrobe? What do you mean?" I opened a door and just found myself here, your majesty," said Edmund. "Ha!" said the queen, speaking more to herself than to him. A door from the world of men. I have heard of such things. This may wreck it all. But he is only young, and he is easily dealt with." As she spoke these words, she rose from her seat and looked at Edmund full in the face, her eyes flaming. At the same moment she raised her wand. Edmund felt sure that she was going to do something dreadful, but he seemed unable to move. Then, just as he gave himself up for lost, she appeared to change her mind.
My poor child, she said in quite a different voice. How cold you look. Come and sleep with me here on the sledge, and I will put my mantle round you, and we will talk. Edmund did not like this arrangement at all, but he dared not disobey. He stepped onto the sledge and sat at her feet, and she put a fold of her fur mantle round him, and tucked it well in. Perhaps something hot to drink, said the Queen. Should you like that? Yes, please, your Majesty, said Edmund, whose teeth were chattering. The Queen took from somewhere among her wrappings a very small bottle, which looked as if it were made of copper. Then, holding out her arm, she let one drop fall from it onto the snow beside the sledge. Edmund saw the drop for a second in midair, shining like a diamond. But the moment it touched the snow, there was a hissing sound, and there stood a jeweled cup, full of something that steamed. The dwarf immediately took this and handed it to Edmund with a bow and a smile. Not a very nice smile. Edmund felt much better as he began to sip the hot drink. It was something he had never tasted before, very sweet and foamy and creamy, and it warmed him right down to his toes. It is dull, son of Adam, to drink without eating, said the Queen presently. What would you like best to eat? Turkish delight, please, your Majesty, said Edmund. The Queen let another drop fall from her bottle onto the snow, and instantly there appeared a round box, tied with green silk ribbon, which, when opened, turned out to contain several pounds of the best Turkish delight. Each piece was sweet and light to the very center, and Edmund had never tasted anything more delicious. He was quite warm now, and very comfortable. While he was eating, the Queen kept asking him questions. At first, Edmund tried to remember that it is rude to speak with one's mouth full, but he soon forgot about this and thought only of trying to shovel down as much Turkish delight as he could. And the more he ate, the more he wanted to eat, and he never asked himself why the Queen should be so inquisitive. She got him to tell her he had one brother and 2 sisters, and that one of his sisters had already been in Narnia, and had a farm there, and that no one except himself and his brother and his sisters knew anything about Narnia. She seemed especially interested in the fact that there were 4 of them, and kept on coming back to it. You are sure there are just 4 of you? She asked. 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve, neither more nor less. And Edmund, with his mouth full of Turkish delight, kept on saying, yes, I told you that before, and forgetting to call her your Majesty, but she didn't seem to mind now. At last the Turkish delight was all finished, and Edmund was looking very hard at the empty box, and wishing that she would ask him whether he would like some more. Probably the Queen knew quite well what he was thinking, for she knew, though Edmund did not, that this was enchanted Turkish delight, and that anyone who had tasted it once would want more and more of it, and would even, if they were allowed, go on eating it till they killed themselves. But she did not offer him any more. Instead, she said to him, Son of Adam, I should so much like to see your brother and your 2 sisters. Will you bring them to me? You were right about fae food. It's literally fae food. It's not explicit in the movie, and everybody beats up on Edmund for selling his siblings out for Turkish delight, but like 1, you could sell your siblings for a single corn chip. That's the most accurate depiction of a sibling relationship I've ever seen. 2, it's enchanted. Shut up. 3, it's wartime. That's why Lucy was so eager to go with Tumnus, is he's got cake and sardines, and they haven't had that for years. They were in World War II. There's rationing. Calm down. I wrote meta for this fandom before I wrote meta for the game recipe. Anyway. I'll try, said Edmund, still looking at the empty box. Because if you did come again, bringing them with you, of course, I'd be able to give you some more Turkish delight. I can't do it now. The magic will only work once. In my own house, it would be another matter. Why can't we go to your house now? Said Edmund. When he had first got onto the sledge, he had been afraid she might drive away with him to some unknown place, from which he would not be able to get back, but he had forgotten about that fear now. It is a lovely place, my house, said the Queen. I'm sure you would like it. There are whole rooms full of Turkish delight. And what's more, I have no children of my own. I want a nice boy whom I could bring up as a prince, and who would be king of Narnia when I am gone. When he was prince, he would wear a gold crown and eat Turkish delight all day long, and you are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met. Should know not to trust your handsomest isn't a fucking word. I think I would like to make you the prince, some day when you bring the others to visit me. Why not now? Said Edmund. His face had become very red, and his mouth and fingers were sticky. He did not look either clever or handsome, whatever the queen might say. "Oh, but if I took you there now," said she, "I shouldn't see your brother and your sisters. I very much want to know your charming relations. You are to be the prince, later on the king. That is understood. But you must have courtiers and nobles. I would make your brother a duke and your sisters duchesses." "There's nothing special about them," said Edmund. "Such sickening behavior. And anyway, I could always bring them some other time." "Oh, but once you were in my house," said the queen, "you might forget all about them. You would be enjoying yourself so much that you wouldn't want the bother of going to fetch them. No, you must go back to your own country now and come to me another day, with them. You understand? It is no good coming without them." "But I don't even know the way back to my own country," pleaded Edmund. "That's easy," answered the witch. "Do you see that lamp?" She pointed with her wand, and Edmund turned to see the same lamppost under which Lucy had met the fawn. "Straight on, beyond that, is the door to the world of men. And now, look the other way." Here she pointed in the opposite direction. "And tell me if you can see two little hills rising above the trees." "I think I can," said Edmund. "Well, my house is between those two hills. So next time you come, you will only have to find the lamppost, and look for those two hills, and walk through the wood till you reach my house. But remember, you must bring the others with you. I might have to be very angry with you if you come alone." "I'll do my best," said Edmund. "And, by the way," said the queen, "you needn't tell them about me. It would be fun to keep it a secret between us two, wouldn't it? Make it like a surprise for them. Just bring them along to the two hills. A clever boy like you will easily think of some excuse for something like that. And when you come to my house, you could just say, 'Let's see who lives here,' or something like that. I'm sure that would be best. If your sister has met one of the fawns, she may have heard strange stories about me. Nasty stories that might make her afraid to come to me. Fawns will say anything, you know. And now—" Please, said Edmund suddenly, "please, couldn't I have just one piece of Turkish delight to eat on the way home?" No, said the queen with a laugh. "You must wait till next time." While she spoke, she signaled to the dwarf to drive on, but as the sledge swept away out of sight, the queen waved to Edmund, calling out, Next time, don't forget! Come soon!" Edmund was still staring after the sledge when he heard someone calling his own name, and looking round, he saw Lucy coming towards him from another part of the wood. "Oh, Edmund," she cried, "so you've got in too! Isn't it wonderful? And now—" "All right," said Edmund. "I see you were right, and it is a magic wardrobe after all. I'll say I'm sorry if you like. But where on earth have you been all this time? I've been looking for you everywhere." "If I'd known you had got in, I'd have waited for you," said Lucy, who was too happy and excited to notice how snappishly Edmund spoke, or how flushed and strange his face was. "I've been having lunch with dear Mr. Tumnus, the fawn, and he's very well, and the White Witch has done nothing to him for letting me go, so he thinks she can't have found out, and perhaps everything is going to be all right after all." "The White Witch?" asked Edmund. "Who's she?" "She is a perfectly terrible person," said Lucy. "She calls herself the Queen of Narnia, but she has no right to be queen at all. And all the fauns and dryads and naiads and dwarfs and animals, at least all the good ones, simply hate her. And she can turn people into stone and do all kinds of horrible things. And she has made a magic so that it is always winter in Narnia. Always winter, but it never gets to Christmas. And she drives about on a sledge drawn by reindeer, with her wand in her hand and a crown on her head." Edmund was already feeling uncomfortable from having eaten too many sweets, and when he heard that the lady he had made friends with was a dangerous witch, he felt even more uncomfortable. But he still wanted to taste that Turkish delight again more than he wanted anything else. "Who told you all that stuff about the White Witch?" he asked. "Mr. Tumnus, the fawn," said Lucy. "You can't always believe what fawns say," said Edmund, trying to sound as if he knew far more than Lucy. "Who said so?" asked Lucy. "Everyone knows it," said Edmund. "Ask anybody you like. But it's pretty poor sport standing here in the snow. Let's go home." "Yes, let's," said Lucy. "Oh, Edmund, I am glad you've got it too. The others will have to believe in Narnia now, and now that both of us have been here. What fun it will be!" But Edmund secretly thought that it would not be as good fun for him as for her. He would have to admit that Lucy had been right before all the others, and he felt sure the others would all be on the side of the fawns and the animals. But he was already more than half on the side of the witch. He did not know what he would say, or how he would keep his secret once they were all talking about Narnia. By this time, they had all walked a good way. Then suddenly they felt coats around them instead of branches, and the next moment they were both standing outside the wardrobe in an empty room. "I say," said Lucy, "you do look awful, Edmund. Don't you feel well?" "I'm all right," said Edmund, but it was not true. He was feeling very sick. "Come on, then," said Lucy. "Let's find the others. What a lot of adventures we shall have now that we're all in it together."
Kidnapping arc is right. With stranger danger isn't a thing if they give you food. Okay, I can't speak for, like, how they were educating kids about stranger danger back in, like, the 40s. But to be fair, these are kids who've been growing up in a war, and it's a magical country. And for all they know, the rules could be different in a magical country. And also they've been, like, probably for as long as at least Lucy can remember, they've been living on wartime rations. So, like, Turkish Delight is a huge deal. That's why, like, sardines were such a big deal for Lucy, you know? Because they were, like, rationing sugar and stuff, so. There's actually, like, a lot of explanation if you look into, like, the context of the time. And it's really interesting. And I have spent a great deal of time thinking about this. Actually, I wrote a whole essay that was theorizing about the importance of the amount of times Lewis talks about closing the door to the wardrobe. I wrote a whole essay for my lit class one year about that. It was so much fun, actually. I was like, I'm just going to present you a conspiracy theory that I have come up with after reading this book. She's a MILF, it's okay. Okay. Honestly, I wonder if anyone I've never explored Narnia fanfiction, but I do wonder if anyone has ever considered writing a Fae AU where they get Edmund. Like, where the Fae get Edmund and he eats some of their food, and so everything in the rest of the world tastes, you know, like the... There are a lot of legends surrounding Fae food, but one of them is if you eat fairy food, and then you go back to the real world, or, you know, even if you eat fairy food in the real world, everything else will taste like dust, like ash and sawdust to you, and so you have no choice but to either waste away or just eat fairy food, which is generally not going to nourish you until you die. So I wonder if there's, like, a fic anywhere about Edmund getting kidnapped by the Fae or lured in by the Fae and eating their food, and then having to come back and maybe, like, heal from that, and like, the real moment of healing is when, or, like, that he realizes he's actually making progress and getting better is when he starts being able to taste things again. But, yeah. Just random thoughts. Anyway.
Chapter 5. Back on this side of the door. Because the game of hide-and-seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter! Susan, it's all true! Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it."
Okay, I need to stop for a minute and just... I think my editor found an Edmund x Voldemort fic once. First off, that is extremely fucked up because Edmund is canonically a minor. Like, for the entire series. Right up until maybe the end. Like, with the exception of the last book, perhaps, but I still think he's a minor. Or maybe just... But, like, that is so fucked up. What the fuck? What the fuck? No, okay. Before I get back to reading, I need to say that, like, there are, like, 3-ish types of people, maybe, like, 4 types of people I trust in the Narnia fandom. I trust the people who talk a lot about Erebus from The Horse and His Boy, who just, like, write detailed stuff about her and make aesthetics and all that stuff. Like, yes, you go. I trust the people who write essays explaining Susan and delving into her character and, like, defending her. I trust people who ship Edmund and Caspian, provided that you are, again, writing Edmund as an adult, because I think he was an adult at one point, yes, when they encountered, yeah, Voyage of the Dawn Treader? Or maybe he wasn't quite 18. If you are writing Edmund as an adult. if he stays in Narnia and ages. But that one is allowed. If not, don't do it. And then, what was it? Oh, the people who, write Susan as bisexual. There's this one mood board that is still on my Tumblr to this day. I deleted about 7,000 posts off of my Tumblr. But the one thing that stayed there. Oh shit, thank you for the resub! 3 months. Oh, thank you so much. Anyway, so there's this mood board that has been on my Tumblr for about 4 or 5 years now. And it is an aesthetic mood board for the ship between Susan Pevensey and Wendy Darling from Peter Pan. And it is literally the best thing I've ever come across. And so I trust people who headcanon Susan to be bisexual. I believe that they are like the salt and light of the earth. Anyway, going back to the chapter. "What's this all about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan, and Edmund gave a very superior look as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference, and then a little snigger, and said, "Ooh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country and the wardrobe was true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head..." Yay. Anyway. Sorry. I can't see the word queer without getting so excited. Oh, Jesus. It's okay, he has character development. He's like Steve Harrington. Wait, I need to stop for a minute. I've only read 3 Narnia books. I've never really been in a fandom, but we all agree that all the Pevensey kids minus Peter are queer, right? Oh, Peter's definitely queer too. They're all gay. All of them. Lucy is asexual and romantic. I refuse to take... Okay, well, like, I don't refuse to take any other interpretations, but that's my hot take. Peter, I would say probably bi. Susan as well. And Edmund is just gay. He's gay. Edmund is simply gay. There's nothing else to it. Anyway. The worst thing the Prince Caspian movie ever did was create a romantic subplot between Susan and Caspian when she's implied to be like 15? 16? Like, what is up with that? When Peter is literally right there. Like, Edmund in that film was probably too young. Because I don't remember how old Caspian is. But Peter's right there. Bro? Anyway. That aside. Of course it's all nonsense, said Peter. That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next? I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. You didn't think anything at all, said Peter. It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now. Do stop it, said Susan. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy.
It was not surprising that when they found Lucy, a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can say or do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you were all beasts." Beasts. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to Father if he thinks there really is something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them, and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them, the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they had finished the whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat, and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they had only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up till now, I'd have said Lucy every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That is more than I know," said the professor, "and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed." "We were afraid it mightn't even be lying," said Susan. "We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean," said the professor quite coolly. "Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see she is not mad." "But then," said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. "Logic," said the professor half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth." Susan looked at him very hard, and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how could it be true, sir?" said Peter. Why did you say that? Why do you say that?" asked the professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was." "What has that got to do with it?" said the professor. "Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time." "Are they?" said the professor, and Peter did not quite know what to say. "But there was no time," said Susan. "Lucy had had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the door. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours." "That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true," said the professor. "If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If, I say, she had got into another world, I should at least be surprised to find that the other world had I should not at all be surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would admit that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable amount of time before coming out and telling her story." "But do you really mean, sir," said Peter, "that there could be other worlds, all over the place, just round the corner, like that?" "Nothing is more probable," said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them while he muttered to himself. "I wonder what they do teach them at these schools." "But what are we to do?" asked Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. "My dear young lady," said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, There is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and it is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he, and that was the end of that conversation. Oh, bye! He shut you down. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. And it had all become a rather alarming subject. And so for a time it looked as if the adventures were coming to an end, but that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it. It was a sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for a manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I am telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. McCready, the housekeeper, showed them round, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. McCready was not fond of children, and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She said to Susan and Peter on almost the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, and please remember you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing round with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventures began for the third time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits, when the two girls rushed into the room and said, "Look out! Here comes the McCready and a whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter. "I don't understand your slang." And the four of them made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they had got out into the green room and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. McCready must be bringing a party of sightseers up the back stairs, instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. McCready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard the voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and flung open the door. All four of them bundled inside the wardrobe and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter had the door closed, but did not shut it, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never ever shut yourself in a wardrobe. Chapter break, getting some water. Chapter 6. Into the Forest. "I wish the McCready would hurry up and take all these people away," said Susan presently. "I'm getting horribly cramped." "And what a filthy smell of camphor," said Edmund. "I expect the pockets of these coats are full of it," said Susan, "to keep away the moths." "There's something sticking into my back," said Peter. "And isn't it cold?" said Susan. "Now that you mention it, it is cold," said Peter. "And hang it all, it's wet too. What's the matter with this place? I'm sitting on something wet. It's getting wetter every minute." He struggled to his feet. "Let's get out," said Edmund. "They've gone." "Oh," said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what was the matter. "I'm sitting against a tree," said Susan. "And look, it's getting light over there." "By Jove, you're right," said Peter. "And look there, and there. It's trees all round. And this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we've got into Lucy's wood after all." And now there was no mistaking it, and all four children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them were coats hanging on pegs. In front of them were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. "I apologize for not believing you," he said. "I'm sorry. Will you shake hands?" "Of course," said Lucy, and did. "And now," said Susan, "what do we do next?" "Do?" said Peter. "Why, go and explore the wood, of course." "Ugh," said Susan, stamping her feet. "It's pretty cold. What about putting on some of these coats?" "They're not ours," said Peter doubtfully. "I'm sure nobody would mind," said Susan. It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We shan't even take them out of the wardrobe." "I never thought of that, Sue," said Peter. "Of course, now that you put it that way, I see. No one could say you had bagged a coat as long as you leave it in the wardrobe where you found it. And I suppose this whole country is in the wardrobe." They immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so that they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than coats when they had put them on. But they all felt a good deal warmer, and each thought the others looked better in their new get-up and more suitable to the landscape. "We can pretend we are Arctic explorers," said Lucy. "This is going to be exciting enough without pretending," said Peter, as he began leading the way forward into the forest. There were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked as if there might be more snow before night. "I say," began Edmund presently, "oughtn't we to be bearing a bit more to the left? That is, if we're aiming for the lamp-post?" He had forgotten for the moment that he must pretend never to have been in the wood before. The moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized that he had given himself away. Everyone stopped and stared at him. Peter whistled. "So you really were here," he said. "That time Lou said she'd met you in here. And you made out she was telling lies." There was a dead silence. "Well, of all the poisonous little beasts," said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed, indeed, no more to say, and presently the four resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, "I'll pay you all out for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied prigs." "Where are we going anyway?" said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. Good night, by the way. "I think Lou ought to be the leader," said Peter. "Goodness knows she deserves it." "Where will you take us, Lou?" "What about going to see Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "He's the nice fawn I told you about." Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. Lucy proved a good leader. At first she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree in one place and a stump in another, and brought them on to where the ground became uneven and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there a terrible surprise awaited them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside, the cave was dark and cold and had the damp feel and smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in front from the doorway, and was heaped on the floor mixed with something black, which turned out to be the charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung it about the room and then stamped it out. The crockery lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been slashed to shreds with a knife. I love the word crockery. It's such a good word. "This is a pretty good washout," said Edmund. "Not much good coming here." "What's this?" said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet to the floor. "Is there anything written on it?" said Susan. "Yes, I think there is," answered Peter, "but I can't read it in this light. Let's go out into the open air." They all went out in the daylight and crowded round Peter as he read out the following words. "The former occupant of these premises, the Fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting his trial on charge of high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia. Chatelaine? That's a French word and I don't understand it. Of Caravel, Empress of the Lone Islands, etc., also of comforting her said Majesty's enemies, harboring spies, and fraternizing with humans. Signed, Maugrin, Captain of the Secret Police. Long live the Queen." The children stared at each other. I don't know that I'm going to like this place after all," said Susan. "Who is this queen, Lou?" said Peter. "Do you know anything about her?" "She isn't a real queen at all," answered Lucy. "She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people, hate her. She has made an enchantment over the whole country so that it's always winter here, and never Christmas." I wonder if there's any point in going on," said Susan. "I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it looks as if there wouldn't be much fun either. And it's getting colder every minute, and we brought nothing to eat. What about just going home?" "Oh, but we can't, said Lucy suddenly. "Don't you see? We can't just go home, not after this. It's all on my account that the poor fawn has got into this trouble. He hid me from the witch and showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the Queen's enemies and fraternizing with humans. We simply must try to rescue him." "A lot we could do," said Edmund, "when we haven't even got anything to eat." "Shut up, you," said Peter, who was still very angry with Edmund. "What do you think, Susan?" "I've a horrid feeling that Lou is right," said Susan. "I don't want to go a step further, and I wish we'd never come. But I think we must try to do something for Mr. whatever his name is. I mean, the fawn." That's what I feel too, said Peter. I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting into this country again once you've got out of it. I think we'll have to go on. So do I, said both the girls. If only we knew where the poor chap was imprisoned, said Peter. They were all still wondering what to do next when Lucy said, Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've ever seen here. I say, I wonder, can birds talk in Narnia? It almost looks as if it wanted to say something to us. Then she turned to the robin and said, Please, can you tell us where Tumnus the fawn has been taken to? And as she said this, she took a step towards the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as to the next tree. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as if it understood all they had been saying. Almost without noticing that they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer to it. At this, the robin flew away again to the next tree, and once more looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder chest or a brighter eye. Do you know, said Lucy, I really believe he means us to follow him. I've an idea he does, said Susan. What do you think, Peter? Well, we might as well give it a try, answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow it. In this way, it led them on slightly downhill. Wherever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently the clouds parted overhead, and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzlingly bright. They had been traveling all this way for about half an hour, with the two girls in front, when Edmund said to Peter, If you're not still too high and mighty to talk to me, I've something to say to you, which you better listen to. What is it? Asked Peter. Hush, not so loud, said Edmund. There's no good frightening the girls. But have you realized what we're doing? What? Said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. We're following a guide we know nothing about. How do we know which side that bird is on? Why shouldn't it be leading us into a trap? It's a nasty idea. Still, a robin, you know? They're good birds in all the stories I've ever read. I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side. If it comes to that, which is the right side? How do we know that the fawns are in the right, and the queen, yes, I know we've been told she's a witch, is in the wrong? We don't really know anything about that either. The fawn saved Lucy. He said he did, but how do we know? And there's another thing, too. Has anyone the least idea of the way home from here? Wait, stop, said Peter. I hadn't thought of that. And no chance of dinner either, said Edmund. Let me see, what's this next chapter? Oh, these chapters are short. Heck yeah. I'm just gonna keep going until my voice dies. Chapter 7. A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind, both the girls suddenly cried out, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin! It's flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look which was as much to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh! Look!" said Susan. "What?" "There's something moving among the trees over there to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Susan presently. "I saw it that time too," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind that big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan, and though nobody said it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of animal," said Susan, and then, look, quick, there it is." They all saw it this time, a whiskered furry face, which had looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put up its paw against its mouth, just as humans put their finger on their lips when they are signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced all around as if it were afraid someone was watching, said "Hush!" made signs to them to join it in the thicker bit of wood where it was standing, and then once more disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail." "It wants us to go to it," said Susan, "and it is warning us not to make a noise." "I know," said Peter. The question is, are we going to do it or not? What do you think, Lou? I think it's a nice beaver, said Lucy. Yes, but how do we know? Said Edmund. Can't we have to risk it? Said Susan. I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel I want some dinner. At that moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to them. Come on, said Peter. Let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy. So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and in behind it. And there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, Farther in! Come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open. Only when it had led them into a dark spot, where 4 trees grew so close that their boughs met and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve? It said. We're some of them, said Peter. Shh, said the beaver. Not so loud, please. We're not safe even here. Why, who are you so afraid of? Said Peter. There's no one here but ourselves. There are the trees, said the beaver. They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her, you know who I mean. And it nodded its head several times. If it comes to talking about sides, said Edmund, how do we know you're a friend? Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver, added Peter, but you see we're strangers. Quite right, said the beaver. Here is my token. And with these words it held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise, till suddenly Lucy said, Oh, of course! It's my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus. That's right, said the beaver. Poor fellow. He got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I was to meet you here and take you on to... Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and he gave 1 or 2 very mysterious nods. Then, signaling to the children to stand close around as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers, it added in a low whisper, They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he's already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do. But in that moment, the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it has some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life, and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is the beginning of the holidays, or the beginning of summer. And what about Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. Where is he? Shh, said the beaver. Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk, and also dinner. No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They all therefore hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest, for over an hour. Everyone was beginning to feel very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to thin in front of them, and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later, they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it could have been running, it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a very large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across the river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that of course beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you are visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say, "Hush," this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished. Above the dam, there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice, But instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the winter had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles. Oh, water, not winter. As if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from a hole in the roof smoke was going up so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamp-post the other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight, and about being a king, and I wonder how Peter would like that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came into his head. Here we are, said Mr. Beaver, and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip. The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not, for humans, a very nice place to walk, because it was covered with ice, and though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in a single file right out to the middle where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed is that as she went in was a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. At last! To think that I ever should live to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish. That I will, said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them, and Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly, looked hard into it, and then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson had whipped out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again until he had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill up the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan and get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no pictures or books, and instead of beds there were bunks, like on board a ship, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the wall were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets, and a pair of shears and spades and trowels, and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the clock on the table, though very clean, was very rough. This sounds like my ideal life. I want to live in a beaver's house, please. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had all become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there is nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago, and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and gloriously sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool, so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a great long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why, now we can get down to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye to the window. "That's all better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks."
Chapter break. Hello, welcome new people. We're just vibing.
Chapter 8. What Happened After Dinner. "And now," said Lucy, "do please tell us what's happened to Mr. Tumnus." "Ah, that's bad," said Mr. Beaver, shaking his head. "That's a very, very bad business. There's no doubt he was taken off by the police. I got that from a bird who saw it done." "But where's he been taken to?" asked Lucy. "Well, they were heading northwards when they were last seen, and we all know what that means." "No, we don't," said Susan. Mr. Beaver shook his head in a very gloomy fashion. "I'm afraid it means they were taking him to her house," he said. "But what'll they do to him, Mr. Beaver?" gasped Lucy. "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "you can't exactly say for sure. But there's not many taken in that ever come out again. Statues. All full of statues, they say it is. In the courtyard and up the stairs and in the hall. People she's turned," he paused and shuddered, "turned into stone." "But Mr. Beaver," said Lucy, "can't we, we must do something to save him. It's too dreadful, and it's all on my account." "I don't doubt you'd save him if you could, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver, "but you'll have no chance of getting into that house again against her will. And ever coming out alive." "Couldn't we have some stratagem?" said Peter. "Couldn't we dress up as something, or pretend to be, peddlers or anything, or wait till she has gone out, or, hang it all, there must be some way. This fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr. Beaver. We can't just leave him to have that done to him." "It's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good your trying, of all people. But now that Aslan is on the move—" "Oh yes, tell us about Aslan," said several voices at once, for once again that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news, had come over them. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" said Mr. Beaver. "Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. But not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll settle the White Queen all right. It is he, not you, who will save Mr. Tumnus." "She won't turn him into stone too?" said Edmund. "Lord love you, son of Adam, what a simple thing to say," answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. "Turn him into stone. As if she could stand on her own 2 feet and look him in the face. It'll be the most she can do, and more—" I need to restart that sentence, good God. "If she can stand on her own 2 feet and look him in the face, it'll be the most she can do, and more than I expect of her. No, he'll put it all to rights, as it says in the old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him." "But shall we see him?" asked Susan. "Why, daughter of Eve, that's why I brought you here." "I'm to lead you where you shall meet him," said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man?" asked Lucy. "Aslan a man?" said the Beaver sternly. "Certainly not. I tell you he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion. The lion. The great lion." "Oh," said Susan. "I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most, or just silly." "Then he isn't safe?" said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." "I'm longing to see him," said Peter, "even if I do feel frightened when it comes to that point." "That's right, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver, bringing his paw down on the table with a crash that made all the cups and saucers rattle. "And so you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him. Tomorrow, if you can, at the stone table." "Where's that?" said Lucy. I'll show you, said Mr. Beaver. It's down the river a good step from here. I'll take you to it. But meanwhile, what about poor Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. The quickest way you can help him is by going to meet Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. Once he's with us, then we can begin doing things. Not that we don't need you to, for it's another of the old rhymes. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So things must be drawing near their end now. He's come, and you've come. We've heard of Aslan coming into these parts before. Long ago, nobody can say when, but there's never been any of your race here before. That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver, said Peter. I mean, isn't the witch herself human? You'd like us to believe it, said Mr. Beaver, and it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes of your father Adam's, and here Mr. Beaver bowed. Your father Adam's first wife. They called her Lilith, and she was one of the Jinn. That's what she comes from on one side. And on the other she comes of the giants. No, there isn't a real drop of human blood in the witch. That's why she's all bad. That's why she's bad all through, Mr. Beaver, said Mrs. Beaver. True enough, Mrs. Beaver, replied he. There may be two views about humans, meaning no offense to the present company, but there is no two views about humans. But there's no two views about things that look like humans and aren't. I don't understand what that sentence means. Yeah, it might be my Wi-Fi, by the way, that's making everything so bad. I can offer no guarantees about the state of my Wi-Fi. I've known good dwarfs, said Mrs. Beaver. So have I, now you come to speak of it, said her husband, but precious few, and they were the ones least like men. But in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that isn't going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and feel for your hatchet. And that's why the witch is always on the lookout for humans in Narnia. She's been watching for you this many a year. And if she knew there were four of you, she'd be more dangerous still. What's that to do with it? Asked Peter. Because of another prophecy, said Mr. Beaver. Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the sea coast, down at the mouth of the river, which ought to be the capital of the whole country, if all was as it should be. Down at Cair Paravel there are 4 thrones, and it's a saying in Narnia, time out of mind, that when 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve sit on those 4 thrones, then it will be the end not only of the White Witch's reign, but of her life. And that is why we had to be so cautious as we came along, for if she knew about you 4, your lives wouldn't be worth a shake of my whiskers. All the children had been attending so hard to what Mr. Beaver was telling them, that they noticed nothing else for a long time. Then suddenly, during the moment of silence that followed his last remark, Lucy suddenly said, I say, where's Edmund? There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside? And then all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly and steadily. The green ice of the pool had vanished under a thick white blanket, and from where the little house stood in the center of the dam you could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles into the soft new snow, and went round the house in every direction. Edmund! Edmund! They called till they were hoarse. But the silently falling snow seemed to muffle their voices, and there was not even an echo in answer. How perfectly dreadful, said Susan, as they at last came back in despair. Oh, how I wish we'd never come. What on earth are we to do, Mr. Beaver? Said Peter. Do, said Mr. Beaver, who was already putting on his snow boots. Do? We must be off at once. We haven't a moment to spare. We'd better divide into 4 search parties, said Peter, and all go in different directions. Whoever finds him must come back here at once, and... Search parties, son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver. What for? Why, to look for Edmund, of course. There's no point in looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean? Said Susan. He can't be very far away yet. And we've got to find him. What do you mean when you say there's no use looking for him? The reason there's no use looking, said Mr. Beaver, is that we know already where he's gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand? Said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, to the White Witch. He's betrayed us all. Oh, surely. Oh, really, said Susan. He can't have done that. Can't he? Said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the 3 children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips, for each felt suddenly quite certain that This was exactly what Edmund had done. But will he know the way? Said Peter. Has he been in this country before? Asked Mr. Beaver. Has he ever been here alone? Yes, said Lucy, almost in a whisper. I'm afraid he has. And did he tell you what he'd done, or who he'd met? Well, no, he didn't, said Lucy. Then mark my words, said Mr. Beaver. He has already met the witch, and joined her side, and been told where she lives. I didn't like to mention it before, him being your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, treacherous. He had the look of one who had been in with the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell them if you've lived long in Narnia. Something about their eyes. All the same, said Peter in a rather choking sort of voice, we've still got to go and look for him. He is our brother after all, even if he is a rather little beast. And he's only a kid. Go to the witch's house, said Mrs. Beaver. Don't you see that the only chance of saving him, either him or yourselves, is to keep away from her? Why, how do you mean? Said Lucy. Why, all she wants is to get all 4 of you. She's thinking all the time of those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel. Once you are all 4 inside her house, her job will be done, and there will be 4 new statues in her collection before you've had time to speak. She'll keep him alive as long as he's the only one she's got, because she'll want to use him as a decoy, as bait to catch the rest of you with. Okay, here's where I have to take a moment and say the White Witch is literally an idiot. Okay, she catches on to this later. But, like, if you're worried about 4 of them, if the prophecy is about 4 of them, and you have 1, solve all of your problems by just killing 1 child, and then there are not 4 of them to sit on the 4 thrones. And therefore, you've already won. Like, duh? But anyway. Oh, can no one help us? Wailed Lucy. Only Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. We must go and meet him. That's our only chance now. It seems to me, my dears, said Mrs. Beaver, that it is very important to know just when he slipped away. How much he can tell her depends on how much he hurt. For instance, had we started talking of Aslan before he left? If not, then we may do very well, for she won't know that Aslan has come to Narnia, or that we are meeting him, and will be quite off her guard as far as that is concerned. I don't remember his being here when we were talking about Aslan, began Peter, but Lucy interrupted him. Oh, yes, he was, she said miserably. Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch couldn't turn Aslan into stone, too. So he did, by Jove, said Peter. Just the sort of thing he would say, too. Worse and worse, said Mr. Beaver. And the next thing is this. Was he still here when I told you that the place for meeting Aslan was a stone table? And of course no one knew the answer to this question. Because if he was, continued Mr. Beaver, then she'll simply sledge down in that direction and get between us and the stone table and catch us on our way down. In fact, we should be cut off from Aslan. But that isn't what she'll do at first, said Mrs. Beaver. Not if I know her. The moment Edmund tells us we're all here, she'll set out to catch us this very night. And if he's been gone about half an hour, she'll be here in another 20 minutes. You're right, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband. We must all get away from here. There's not a moment to lose. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end it here because my voice is kind of dying and I want to go make some hot chocolate and vibe, and I also need to get to bed because I'm probably going to stream in the morning. So anyway, sorry about the bad Wi-Fi. I think we're going to keep doing Storytime Sundays from here again, at least until I finish, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We could do the rest of Narnia. I don't know. I've actually got a lot of books that I'd be interested in reading, like The Hobbit. I've got a Ghost series that would be really fun to do. Since it's, September, beginning in October, it would be really fun to do Lockwood & Co. I've got Six of Crows. There's a lot I could do. I would think it would be interesting to branch out past, just fan fiction for a while. Simply because I miss books. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming. Happy 1 year to me on Twitch. I know some of you guys have been here since the beginning. Thank you so much for that. It means a lot more than you realize, just whether you got here at the beginning or whether you've, just joined. I appreciate all of you. Why is Nikki live again? She's been live 2 times today. Holy moly, Nikki, you are just on the grind. Okay. Anyway, we are gonna go raid somebody. Who shall we raid?
So there's somebody doing a comic. Let me look at that. Oh, this looks like a cool comic. Yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and raid Nebellyhood. I probably mispronounced that. Anyway. Drink some water, do your homework, take some meds, go to bed. Good afternoon, good morning, and good night. Oh, I can't raid them. That's depressing. We're just gonna end then. Bye.